Well, good afternoon. My name is Pat Kelly. I'm a Jesuit teacher here at Seattle University, and I teach mainly in the undergraduate college in theology, religious studies. And I want to thank Terry and
It's okay. Deanne.
And Deanne for the invitation to come and talk with you today. The area that they asked me to talk about is you can see it in the title here, Body, Mind, Spirit, the basis for spirituality, recreation, and sport. Maybe I just say a couple things about how I became interested in this kind of topic. When I was younger, I loved to play sports. It was, we all enjoyed different things. That was the place of my joy and passion. I played basketball and football, and ended up playing football through college. And then when I was in college, I began to read the Bible and become interested in questions of faith and my own personal faith life. I was raised Catholic, but I think my faith really sort of awakened in a new way in college. And then I went on and studied some theology and was teaching in school and things like that. And I thought when I was in my 20s that the idea was that I should put behind me all of the childish things, like St. Paul says. When I became a man, then I put behind me these games and sports, and be about the adult things of living the Christian life and things like that. But I discovered over time that that didn't work, at least in my own experience, because I had been so profoundly shaped, for good and for ill, by the games and sports that I was engaged in when I was a young person, and that formation was profoundly affecting even my attempts to live the Christian life. In my 20s, my later 20s, I was going on. So I started to see that doesn't really work. I have one life. I have one life, and a part of it was playing games and sports. And now I was in my 20s, and I was doing studying and teaching and things like that. But it's one life. I think in retrospect, I think I had kind of an implicit dualism going. As though the body, all the activities I was involved with in the body, had nothing to do with the mind or things that I was to be thinking about. Or all of these activities that took place in the body had nothing to do with the spiritual dimension of existence that I was now kind of, explicitly committing myself to. I actually think that dualism was not only in me. I think it's in the air. It's in the culture in a lot of ways, especially since Descartes. I'll maybe say a little more about that later. But if you think of even in universities today, there are a lot of issues. It seems like sometimes there can develop an academic wing of the university and an athletic wing of the university, and the two have very little, if anything, to do with one another. And rarely, unless a person's studying physical education, would a person who's spending all that time, now I'm talking about varsity athletes on intercollegiate teams, rarely would a person who's spending all of their time doing those sorts of things be asked in the classroom context to reflect upon what they're doing and the experiences that they're having. So I think that dualism is present in the culture and even in our own academic institutions. It was when I made the spiritual exercises as a novice that I felt like there was an invitation to stay connected to all of these human experiences that I'd had. That they were a part of how God, the way I started to understand it, was working in my life. And then over time, through the exercises and in other contexts, I felt a call to work in this area, and maybe to help other people in this area too. So Terry told me just keep it, my remarks relatively short, so I'll do that. But I wanted to show you some pictures because I think they're fun, and not yet, but and then a couple other things too. But here's here's my thesis. No, you're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to say, here's my thesis. My thesis related to the title, Body, Mind, Spirit. I think with Paul, Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, he has an understanding of the human person as a unity of body, mind, and spirit. And subsequent Christian authors picked up on that. Spiritual writers understood the human person that way too. Unity of body, mind, and spirit. And the spiritual dimension, that spirit, small letter s, is important because for Paul, it's the spirit that makes the human person capable of God. It's the place in the person where they're most immediately related to God. So for Paul, there's more to the human being than the rational dimension, which the Greeks might have, really highlighted as kind of the most important dimension of a human person. Other writers in the Christian tradition thought of the person as a unity of body and soul. And it really was the unity that they emphasized. So the soul, throughout the medieval period, had vegetative powers, which basically have to do with existence. Plants have those too. Had sensitive powers, which has to do with the life of the senses. So animals, other mammals have that as well. And the soul had rational powers too. So for the medieval thinkers, soul was present in every dimension of physicality in human experience. I think with Descartes in the 17th century, that sense of the unity of the person starts to fall apart. Maybe some of you are familiar with how he described the human person. The soul is immaterial, conscious, unextended, and the body is material, unconscious, extended. So he described them as radically dissimilar. And the problem that he left subsequent philosophers was how to get these two back together. How are they related? So that's something that people wrestle with. Some people in the wake of Descartes simply dismiss the soul. You can't measure it, after all, is what some of the scientific mindset would have said. And so began to think about the human strictly in material terms. And one of the most common analogs they used for the human body was the machine. Okay, so they're described as mechanists, these folks. That was similar to the way other scientists were understanding the human world, the material world itself in mechanistic terms. Now I think this actually influences sport today to some extent. Here's a quote from an NFL player, Dave Megacy. I realized paradoxically how cut off and removed I was from my body. I knew my body more thoroughly than most men are ever able to, but I had used it and thought of it as a machine, a thing that had to be well-oiled, well-fed, and well taken care of to do a specific job. So there's a tendency at times for athletes to think about their own body as machines, as a kind of instrument, tool. So that heritage makes it very difficult to think about what a spirituality this activity would be, because it seems like there's no way out of the box that the human person has been put in. So my thought is that we need to retrieve the earlier understandings of the human person, Paul's, that emphasize the unity of body, mind, and spirit, right? Or it might be body and soul. Because then, now when I say retrieve, I don't mean like in an uncritical way. I think we need to do it, informed by contemporary understandings of the human person too. But what that allows us to do, or what it is to say that if I'm a unity of body, mind, and spirit, then the activities that I'm engaged in my body also affect my consciousness. They affect my thinking, because I'm a unity of body, mind, and spirit. And when you put the small letters S, spirit, in there, they also have potentially a spiritual dimension to them, these kind of activities. So that's the sense in which I think body, mind, spirit can be a basis for spirituality, recreation, and sport. Maybe just for laughs, we can look at some of the images that I have here. So these are images from, this one is from stained glass window of Gloucester Cathedral in 1350 of somebody playing a game with a stick and a ball. They used to call this a golfer, but golf actually hadn't been invented yet, so it's some other game. In the medieval period, games and sports were played on all of the feast days and holy days, which there were 120 some, 130 some, depending on the part of the country. And what I'm showing here is that, interestingly, they're depicted in stained glass windows, woodcuts, prayer books, which suggests that during this period, the people didn't think there was some sort of problem with playing and their religious faith. So if we could just, so this is a prayer book from 1300 with depictions of people playing ball games in the bottom margin. Again, the important thing, prayer books. Yeah, you can go to the next one. So here's a depiction actually of all the feast days and holy days in the top there, and then this is some sort of ball game we're playing. There are two balls here, and the roof in some way is involved in this game. Early 16th century, another listing of the feast days, and then a game of handball depicted in this prayer book. And a similar game maybe to the first depiction that we saw in the stained glass window in a 15th century Book of Hours. And then this one is in the same cathedral that stained glass window is. This was in the choir place, the place where the monks would come in and chant the divine office. So they'd be there 4 or 5 times a day. And they had to stand during the office. And some of the older fellows couldn't stand for quite as long. So they had these chairs that they could fold up, and then they could sort of sit while they're standing, while they're doing the office. Well, on the underside of these chairs were depicted the activities of daily life. Here's a picture of 2 people playing a ball game in one of them. Children tobogganing here. This was this was a book that had the different months. So I think this was January. You can see some of the activities there in the top associated with the month, and then also some of the recreational activities. Here's an early 14th century prayer book, Flemish. Could you go back to that one? With tobogganing and skating. And then this is the Feast of St. Martin here. And he's famous, of course, for cutting his cloak and giving half to a beggar while he was riding on a horse. And here we have boys riding hobby horses. And then just a celebration of May Day. I did my own doctoral studies with a social scientist named Csikszentmihalyi, who's the author of this, the author of something called the flow theory. I just want to give you an example of how using that foundation I was talking about, body, mind, spirit, we could look at the activities that people engage in and maybe try to get a sense of the spiritual dimension of them. Could you go to the first slide? This is a picture of when I was in India for about a year. I was doing some training with the Jesuits, and we had Children's Day for some kids who lived poorer kids who lived in the mountains. So this social scientist discovered on the basis of his research that people describe their lives as going well, most rewarding when they were engaged in challenging activities that require skills. It could be academic activities, could be artistic, could be games and sports, right? And when a person's involved in a challenging activity that requires skill, then the activity demands that I'm fully there. No, Csikszentmihalyi uses the term one-pointedness of mind. Right? So I'm not distracted by things around me, but I'm fully present to what it is I'm doing. And I think this young boy's face, he's trying to put he has like a fishing rod we made for him out of wood, and then a string on the end, and he's trying to put a ring on the top of a Coke bottle. And I think his face depicts this kind of one-pointedness of mind. It's a beautiful thing because even children, can experience this kind of thing. Okay. Here he is again. He's fully in there, right? Got to get that thing on top of that Coke bottle. And yeah. And then another way that he describes this is there's a merging of action and awareness, right? So the way he puts it, one is very aware of one's actions, but not of the awareness itself. This boy is very aware of what he's trying to do, but he's not aware of the awareness itself. So there's a merging, what he calls a merging of action and awareness. So what I'm doing and what I'm thinking about are one and the same thing. One pointedness of mind. There's an integration. We can go to the next. This is a high school basketball player says, when I get hot in a game, like I said, you don't think about it at all. If you step back and think about why you're so hot, all of a sudden you get cream. Right? So what is he saying? He's saying when he's hot, he's not aware of himself. He's not explicitly, he doesn't have the psychic energy to be standing outside of the activity and explicitly reflecting on himself. And he notices, this is a 15-year-old boy, he hasn't studied psychology or anything else. He notices that if he's hot in a game, let's say he's got 28 points at halftime, middle of the third quarter, he's doing great. And then this question comes into his mind, why am I so hot? Why is it so good? Then what has he done? He's split that action and awareness. Now he's standing outside of himself and explicitly reflecting on himself, even though it's a positive question, because things are going well. That can disrupt. He says, all of a sudden you get creeped. So this would be related to this other principle, what Csikszentmihalyi calls egolessness. You know, actually it's what I was just describing in a way. When we're fully present to what we're doing, we don't have the psychic energy left to be standing outside and explicitly reflecting upon myself, right? So I'll just give you a quick example. I experienced a lot of these kind of things when I was ordained a priest, and I was in a parish in Detroit for 1 year after my ordination. And then my classmate from the novitiate came from England, from London, where he was studying theology, one Sunday to our parish. And he was sitting in about the 5th row or so. And I was giving my homily there, right near him, and I started to wonder halfway through the homily, I wonder what Ben thinks about my homily. Is he impressed, you know, with his classmate, things like that? Well, that's how you get creamed in giving a homily, you know. And what's happened is I've taken the perspective of Ben outside of the activity, and now I'm thinking about myself instead of thinking about God, the needs of the community, the readings from Scripture that all pull me out of myself. Here I'm explicitly reflecting on myself. He says during flow experiences, we're not thinking about ourselves in that way. It's a really interesting thing. So artists at the peak of their creativity, or athletes, you know, let's say an athlete just has a brilliant game, and then afterwards what's going to happen? He or she's going to get all this attention from the media. It's all on them. But while they're doing it, they're actually not thinking about themselves. No, at the highest level, if they're performing, if they're having this kind of an experience, not thinking about themselves at all. So there's a kind of egolessness to it. And then egolessness and self-transcendence. This is a quote from Csikszentmihalyi. When not preoccupied with ourselves, we actually have a chance to expand the concept of who we are. Loss of self-consciousness can lead to self-transcendence, to a feeling that the boundaries of our being have been pushed forward. So after the activity,